There's a short by Alex O'Connor that's something to the tune of "God doesn't own me." And it's a debate between him and a Christian, and they're talking about the scenario as if God had broken into your house and done a lot of damage in there and you were really upset by it, but then you found out that there was actually a payoff at the end that would be worth more than that. How would you deal with it? Would you be okay with being troubled in the meantime for a larger payoff later on? Well, Alex O'Connor's response was massively telling, and I'm just going to read the entire response to you, and then I'm going to break it down. He said, "I don't see myself as a part of God's house. At best, I would see myself as a visitor within God's house, who had no choice but to be in God's house. If I was in my own house and I dragged somebody into my house through no choice of their own, and then forced them to undergo some suffering, and then threw some money at them and said, 'I have the right to do this. And firstly, this is my home, and secondly, I've compensated for it. So if anything, you should be grateful.' I think this would be gross." Wow, this tells us so much. I want to just pick this apart for a second. One of the first things he says is, "I don't see myself as part of God's house." This is where I think Alex O'Connor is being absolutely honest, and there's a difference between Christians and non-Christians. So he's making it very clear. I don't see myself as part of God's house. There's this disassociation going on there, and I think that's natural between Christians and non-Christians, and it's easy to understand. Well, then he goes in further and he says, "At best, I would see myself as a visitor within God's house." And I'm going to say up front, I understand here he is giving a little leeway. He is actually trying to tiptoe to the other side of the fence, just carefully, and trying to consider things from the other side. I get it. He says, at best, and this is not absolutely totally what he believes, and he's entering into the metaphor. I understand these things. But what I want you to understand is that we respond from the totality of who we are and what we know. And his response is very telling. He says, "At best, I would see myself as a visitor." Again, disassociation, separation between God's people and not God's people, or Christians and non-Christians. And he says, "as a visitor within God's house." And I think there you will find a reference that he does realize that he is in and within God's reality. Now, I know that every atheist watching this, or probably most, are going to say that's not what he means. And he might even himself say that's not what he means. But you draw metaphors from your understanding. And so all of a sudden he places himself in this and he's like, at best I see myself as a visitor within God's house. He's trying to frame what he really believes. And I think he has told a little bit about what he really believes. He said, but who had no choice but to be in God's house. And there's something here that really describes the flavor of atheism. He says he has no choice because they really want freedom above everything else. They want my decisions to be at the pinnacle, not God's decisions. And he says, if I was in my own house and I dragged somebody in my house through no choice of their own, and then force them to undergo some suffering. So here again, you see, he believed in, he says, when you don't have a choice and you're doing this by force, this really has something to do with the will. The will is so important to an atheist. It's got to be first and foremost. It can't be somebody else's will first. It has to be my will first. Now, I don't understand this. I don't have a problem with this. If somebody else made a dessert. Let's just say they made this awesome cream cheesecake and it had new flavors and styles to it that nobody ever really pondered before, and it was delicious. And they made it on their own time frame, on the day that they chose, and it was in their fridge. And I come along and I don't have any choice in the matter of what they're doing or when they're doing it, but they offer it and they say, hey, would you like some dessert? It's here if you want to get some. I don't mind entering into and enjoying something that somebody else has already thought through and established just because I'm second place on that, I don't mind coming along. But there's something in atheism where deeply seated, they've got to be first, and it's got to be my will, and it's got to be my way, etc. And I just want you to see that in there. And he says, so if I was forced to undergo this suffering, or he is actually putting it on in different terms at this point. He's saying, if I did this to somebody, but he's speaking for God. He said, if they were forced to undergo suffering, and then they just threw money at me. They just threw money at me and said, this is compensation. Well, this is a wrong analysis. This is kind of where the metaphor was sideways. And in a sense, Alex O'Connor was right for arguing against this point, because there is no amount of money that's going to offset suffering. So for instance, let's say we could give somebody a gold card with unlimited spending. You never have to pay it off. Just get whatever you want with this card. And if somebody doesn't take the card, we'll go to the bank and get all the amount of cash that you need from this card to go pay for whatever. That will not offset the death of somebody close in your family. It's not going to offset a fight that you have with somebody where you're still in contention. All that money can buy some distraction, but it doesn't resolve the problems. And so this is not a fair analysis by any stretch of the imagination, comparing suffering to fiscal resources. That's silly. So he is right to argue with that. But it is wrong to think that there's not any kind of compensation that could ever offset incredible pain. So this might be the reason that there is a lot of young atheists out there who have been tragically hurt, maybe in their church or by their dad, or their life situation. It's just pummeling and beating down on me. And there is, and this is so telling about position, they're basically saying there is nothing in life that's quite this bad. It's so bad that it overtakes God. Like there's no way he could offset this kind of pain and suffering. But what's funny is time heals all wounds. We're very familiar with this. Those of us that have been through terrible crises, horrible, heart-wrenching things, we know that eventually time heals some of these things and it takes the edge off. And there are things in life that are beautiful and worthwhile. But to say no amount of compensation could ever offset this suffering is pretty prideful. And on top of that, it's like saying my suffering is worse than everybody else's suffering. There is nothing, because most people don't say those kind of things. And then it's also just like a very telling insight into who that person is, that they're like, this suffering is awful. It is terribly awful. In fact, the whole point in this of looking at the suffering so much, and it's all done to tear down God, okay? All of this suffering is to tear down God, but it totally negates personal suffering, and I'll explain that. It totally overlooks that we make our own hell so often. So imagine the guy that decides that, I'm going to date that girl. She looks like trouble. She really looks like trouble. But, she's got a personality. And we create our own hell, do we not? We're like, I'm just going to risk, whatever the outcome is, because, she's bad news and 3 people warned me, but I'm going to jump into that anyway and just see how this turns out. So we create our own hell, but we want to really tear down God by how terrible suffering is in life. But the reason we do that is if we can tear down God, then it's somehow or another takes the rules out from over top of us. And if the rules are taken off the top of us, then we can create our own heaven. But this actually doesn't work, because if it was working, atheists would be the most positive people on the planet, and they would be leading people out of darkness into wonderful daylight. They would be so positive. They would have all these shortcuts like, hey, I was under this false set of rules and now life is amazing. And I will say probably some of them say that in the short term. But there would be all this positivity, etc. But the actual focus of the premier atheist, their life is to focus on suffering and everything being God's fault, which kind of points out that they really think that God does exist and that it is his fault, instead of actually just spending all their time working on their own life. Back to where we were at. So this also saying that there's no compensation that's worth this kind of suffering, also totally disregards things like suffering on purpose. So, for instance, these philosopher atheists, these ones that read and study material because they don't want to be caught with their pants down. They want to have an answer for all these things, and they watch endless videos, and they take further classes, and they call people and compare notes, and they stay up long hours. That's suffering. But they believe the compensation is worth it. So at some point, the suffering of life, it's okay to suffer for greater compensation. But further in this, Alex O'Connor made the whole entire point there. He said, if there's somebody that is forcing somebody into a situation that is suffering, and then they offer some payoff, and they say, you're my property, this is my right to do this to you. He goes, I think that's gross. That's just gross. When does gross and disgusting equal a valid point? But I understand there is expressing things, but that totally neglects our understanding of child raising. We on purpose take children and force them to suffer. Say, I don't care if you want to watch television, you're not watching television, you need to go practice playing piano. I don't care if you're doing this, I want you to go do your homework. I don't care if you don't want to go to school today, you're going to go and suffer, and the payoff is going to be worth it. So, as I was mentioning, all this blaming suffering upon God, it's not fair, it's not right, God really doesn't exist because of all these things, but we believe that suffering is right in our personal studies. We believe suffering is okay to inflict on little helpless children, like it is really suffering. We know because we remember. But to actually know there is compensation makes it worthwhile. But to say it is wrong in the God scenario, but it's right in my scenario, is not actually applying logic correctly. And that misapplication of logic is what I think is terribly gross.